This video answers the question, is Egyptology a pseudoscience? Greetings, my name is Stephen Myers, and the purpose of this video is to answer this question, is Egyptology a pseudoscience? Wow, that is quite a question. Some would instantly say Egyptology can't be a pseudoscience. They would say, how can it be a pseudoscience? Egyptology is taught in college, and therefore it can't be a pseudoscience. Well, phrenology was taught in college too, not very long ago. So just because something is taught in college doesn't mean it is not a pseudoscience. But hey, we're getting way ahead of ourselves. So let's start with the definition of pseudoscience and go from there. That seems like a good place to begin in answering the question, is Egyptology a pseudoscience? Okay, so here is the definition of a pseudoscience. A pseudoscience consists of statements, beliefs, or practices that are claimed to be both scientific and factual, but are incompatible with the scientific method. Wow, that is interesting. A pseudoscience claims to be both scientific and factual, yet a pseudoscience is also not consistent with the scientific method. Okay, that seems like a reasonable and accurate definition. We can work with that. Trust me, we will get back to the scientific method part soon enough. On the screen is an image that provides more detailed examples of the profound contrast between real science and pseudoscience. So, if a field of study, or a so-called theory, or even a self-professed science meets the criteria on the left side of the image, then it would be reasonable to say that field of study has characteristics of a science. But on the other hand, if a field of study, or a so-called theory, or even a self-professed science exhibits the characteristics on the right side, then it would be reasonable to say that field of study exhibits the characteristics of a pseudoscience. I didn't make the image, but it sure rings true. As you read the left side, it is describing science, but reading the right-hand side, the image describes pseudoscience. It is a powerful image contrasting science with pseudoscience. Well, while reading that picture and pondering the information that picture contains, I came to the stunning realization that the right-hand side is describing Egyptology. Although I have had serious reservations about Egyptology for many years, it wasn't until I studied this image and conducted additional extensive research that I realized Egyptology exhibits all the characteristics described in the right-hand side of this picture. Isn't it amazing that Egyptology meets every criteria on the right-hand side of the picture? Egyptology checks off every bullet point written in red. Wow. Pause the video if you want to take more time studying the picture. Does that make Egyptology a pseudoscience? Let's withhold our judgment for just a little while and answer that question after we have examined each bullet point on the right of the picture to see if it is describing Egyptology. Okay, then we will examine the first bullet point to see if it is a characteristic of Egyptology. Does Egyptology start with a conclusion and then work backwards to confirm? That seems to describe Egyptology to a T. Let's look at some examples. Egyptologists say the Great Pyramid was a tomb. That notion started at the beginning of Egyptology. Egyptology's beginnings has been shaped by the mindset of tomb robbers. With that mindset, Egyptology started with the conclusion that the Great Pyramid was a tomb. Starting with that conclusion has warped their understanding of this structure from day one. Starting with the tomb conclusion, Egyptologists say the golden burial treasure that there is no evidence for must have been stolen in ancient times, well before Egyptologists could steal it. Egyptology contends that no evidence of golden treasure is proof that it was once there and the Great Pyramid was a tomb. Starting with a conclusion is a characteristic of a pseudoscience. To a hammer, everything is a nail, and to Egyptologists looking for golden burial treasure to steal, the Great Pyramid is considered, to Egyptologists that is, to be a tomb. People ask, how come the Great Pyramid doesn't seem to be designed like a tomb? The pharaoh has only one body and there are many rooms. Egyptology, which starts with a conclusion that the Great Pyramid is a tomb, has made up the story that, well, this is what happened. The Great Pyramid doesn't look like a tomb because the builders didn't really know what they were doing and they made several design changes during construction. Egyptology says the Great Pyramid is a tomb, but it doesn't look like a tomb because the builders changed the tomb design, which made the Great Pyramid tomb not look like a tomb. Egyptologists say they know this because they start with a conclusion and work backwards to make up a story out of thin air to somehow justify their faulty conclusion they started out with. People ask, how do long open passageways and sliding stones and doors on pivots protect the pharaoh's mummy and the golden treasure? That is an important question, and I will repeat it. How do long open passageways and sliding stones and doors on pivots protect the pharaoh's mummy and the golden treasure? Egyptology has started with a conclusion that the Great Pyramid is a tomb, and therefore they are unable to provide a coherent answer to that question. I can give many more examples of Egyptology meeting the first characteristic of a pseudoscience of starting with a conclusion, but we will keep progressing and examine the second bullet point in the picture. Is Egyptology hostile to criticism? Are you kidding? Being hostile to criticism is the defining characteristic of Egyptology. Yes, it is true, but you don't have to believe me. Go ask somebody. Ask this question to anyone you know. Of all the sciences, which one is legendary for being hostile to criticism? The answer will be Egyptology, unless you ask an Egyptologist, and those people always deny it. Egyptologists are even hostile to the criticism that they are hostile to criticism. Wow. Ask this guy if Egyptology is hostile to criticism. I am sure he will agree that Egyptology is very hostile to criticism. Here is another person who has been on the receiving end of monumental character assassination and insults from Egyptology because he dared to disagree with Egyptology. Dr. Robert Schoch was bullied and demeaned by Egyptology because he has a different assessment of the age of the Sphinx than Egyptology's guess. Here's another guy. He is probably the most famous living Egyptologist. Ask yourself, or anyone else, this question. Is he known for being hostile to criticism? Any answer other than a resounding yes is a lie. But it is not just him. If you meet an Egyptologist, that person is hostile to criticism. It is as simple as that. So yeah, Egyptology is famous for being hostile to criticism, and it is one of the defining characteristics of Egyptology. Does that make Egyptology a pseudoscience? Hold on. Let's not get hasty and answer that question yet. Let's look at all the other bullet points in this picture before we answer the question. Does Egyptology use vague jargon to confuse and evade? Oh yes, they do, but in a very insidious way. They love to do that a lot, especially in regards to anything involving the construction of the Great Pyramid. What Egyptology does is use words that have very clear and straightforward meaning, and then transform those words into vague jargon that they use to confuse and evade. In the real world, that is, outside the realm of Egyptology, these words have clear and concise meanings, but it is a different story in Egyptology. Let's go through some examples just for fun of words Egyptology uses in an unclear manner, which has resulted in vague jargon that is intended to confuse and evade. Here is a whopper of an example. Big ramp. Oh, they love that one. How big was it? What was the big ramp's configuration? Where was it precisely located? What was its volume? Was it larger than the volume of the finished Great Pyramid? What exactly was it made of? How steep was the big ramp? How was it used? In other words, how were big heavy stones moved up the big ramp? The answer of those questions would reduce the vagueness of the Egyptology's use of the jargon big ramp. But coherent answers to those questions are sorely lacking. That makes the term big ramp very vague, and the use of that term is a way to evade a reasoned and rational explanations. Here's another example of vague jargon used to confuse and evade. The word cut has become vague jargon used to confuse and evade rational explanations. Let me explain. Egyptology contends the stones of the Great Pyramid were cut using hand tools. That seems straightforward at first glance, but the casing stones of the Great Pyramid are cut to extreme precision. Ask an Egyptologist, how are these stones cut using hand tools to produce the large-scale extreme precision of Great Pyramid casing stones? That is a fair enough question to understand what Egyptology means by their jargon cut. But Egyptology will not explain the meaning of the word cut or show how cuts were accomplished with extreme precision by providing a valid demonstration. Egyptology has never cut stone to make a full-size casing stone. So in the realm of Egyptology, the word cut is a vague jargon used to convey and evade. Here's another example of Egyptology turning seemingly simple words into vague jargon. The term hand tools is a wonderful example of Egyptology's vague jargon. Everyone knows what hand tools are, but in the realm of Egyptology, the words hand tools has become strangely vague jargon. Here are some hand tools that Egyptology asserts were used to make the precise stone cuts of Great Pyramid casing stone. Here is a hammer and chisel. Only in the domain of Egyptology do these hand tools become vague jargon, because Egyptology asserts these hand tools were used to make large-scale precision cuts to make casing stones. Hey, look at me, I'm using hand tools, like Egyptologists say it was done. But the term hand tools have become the epitome of vagueness because Egyptology has never performed a single demonstration using hand tools that produced a full-size casing stone like those of the Great Pyramid. Yes, we know hand tools supposedly were used, but it is a very vague because they don't show how these hand tools actually worked. They don't have a demonstration of using hand tools. No demonstration is forthcoming, which means the idea of hand tools is very vague. The purpose of these types of vague jargon is to confuse and evade, and Egyptology is very good at that. Egyptology uses the word cut, but do we know how these precision cuts were made? No, because Egyptology has refused and evaded people on that subject for over 100 years. The same is true with the big ramp and hand tools vague jargon. These and other examples of vague jargon are used to confuse and evade. What they are evading is the inadequacy of Egyptology's explanations of virtually anything associated with the Great Pyramid and so much more. That is why the jargon hand tools is very vague, and hand tools has become a catchphrase or a jargon they use to tell a story that cannot be validated using the scientific method. So, Egyptology meets the criteria of using vague jargon to confuse and evade, which is a characteristic of so-called science of Egyptology. Uh-oh, I said scientific method. Remember, the definition of pseudoscience, it is pseudoscience consists of statements, beliefs, or practices that are claimed to be both scientific and factual, but are incompatible with the scientific method. We will save that scientific method part until later. Okay, let's go to the next bullet point in the image that contrasts science with pseudoscience. Does Egyptology make claims that go beyond the evidence? That is an excellent description of Egyptology, and it is their go-to modus operandi. Here are some examples. Egyptology makes the grandiose claim that knuckle draggers pulled stones up the big ramp. The largest stones of the Great Pyramid weigh about 70 tons. Egyptology has never moved or lifted any 70-ton payload 1 inch, but they say working people could do it all day long. Without substantiation in the form of a valid demonstration, the big ramp stone pulling claim is way beyond the evidence. There is no valid evidence in the form of an appropriate demonstration validating the idea of dragging a 70-ton stone up a ramp. Egyptology cannot perform such a demonstration. Another example of the grandiose claim is Egyptologist says the precision cuts of Great Pyramid casing stones was accomplished using hand tools. Wow, I just said a bunch of vague jargon that Egyptology uses. The reality is that Egyptology has never cut a single casing stone or even cut one surface of a single casing stone like those of the Great Pyramid, ever. Egyptology makes many rather grandiose claims that go beyond the evidence, which are not substantiated using a single valid demonstration using the scientific method. Oops, I said scientific method. We will address that later. The fifth characteristic of a pseudoscience from the image we are using is cherry-picking only favorable evidence and relying on testimonials or weak evidence. Oh my golly, this characteristic is the standard operating procedure for Egyptology. I could do an entire video on just how Egyptology embraces the logical fallacy of cherry picking, but in this video, I'll just mention a few things that Egyptology uses cherry picking to avoid. Egyptology cherry picks data to avoid the fact that precision stone cutting, like that on Great Pyramid casing stones using hand tools, has never been demonstrated. Egyptology cherry picks data to avoid the fact that moving a heavy stone around the corner of a spiral ramp has never been demonstrated. Egyptology cherry picks data to avoid the fact that moving a heavy stone on or off of a barge has never been demonstrated. These and so many other facts are what Egyptology uses cherry picking as a means to avoid these facts Egyptology doesn't like. Does Egyptology use testimonials or weak evidence? They sure do. Instead of using the scientific method, Egyptologists simply declare edicts that are not accompanied with valid demonstrations as a way of conducting science. Here are some examples which are pivotal to the so-called science of Egyptology. The precision stone cutting of Great Pyramid casing stones was accomplished using hand tools. That edict is just a testimonial that is very weak evidence because it is not substantiated by any valid demonstration. Here is another example of a testimonial that is a common edict proclaimed by Egyptologists. 70-ton stones were dragged up a big ramp. That edict is weak evidence because Egyptology has never accompanied that edict with a valid and legitimate demonstration that produced applicable results. These types of piss-poor testimonials and weak evidence without demonstrations abound in the realm of Egyptology. But the lack of any convincing demonstration leads us to the next bullet point in the image we are using to determine if Egyptology is or is not a pseudoscience. That bullet point is uses flawed methods with unrepeatable results. Just as the image indicates, I would say using flawed methods with unrepeatable results is a characteristic of a pseudoscience. How fascinating it is that Egyptology embodies this characteristic to an extreme. Egyptology is even worse than having unrepeatable results. Yes, it's true. Egyptology is even worse than that. Instead of having unrepeatable results, Egyptology has no results in the first place. How can Egyptology have unrepeatable results when there are no results to repeat? Let me explain. Egyptology has never cut a casing stone like those at the Great Pyramid using hand tools. Egyptology has never made a casing stone. Therefore, the results are not repeatable because there has never been any results of a valid demonstration to make a casing stone like those of the Great Pyramid in the first place. Egyptology has never moved or lifted a 70-ton payload 1 inch. So the results of their so-called demonstrations cannot be repeated because there are no demonstrations that have produced results in the first place. Don't get me wrong. I didn't say Egyptology has not conducted demonstrations. What I am saying is that the few demonstrations conducted by Egyptology uses flawed methods. Egyptology will drag a few 1.5-ton stones a few feet and then contend that is how all of the stones of the Great Pyramid, including the massive 70-ton stones, were moved and set in place by workers pulling these stones up a big ramp. I will give an illustration indicating why this type of flawed demonstration is simply a deception. I can lift a full-size automobile up over my head with just my arms. I can grab a Ford or a Chevy, a full-size vehicle, and lift it up. I can pick up an automobile. Do you simply believe me, or do you want proof? Okay. You want me to engage in the scientific method and prove what I just said about lifting a car. Okay, fair enough. I will perform a demonstration that proves I can lift a full-size car. Okay, are you ready? Watch closely, and I will show how I can lift a full-size automobile with just my bare hands. Okay, here I go. I am conducting the demonstration. I am going to do it now. I'm lifting a car. You ready? Wow, look. That is awesome. I have lifted the Hot Wheels car over my head, and from that we can infer that from my demonstration, I am able to lift a full-size car over my head. I did a demonstration. Then I declared an edict. Are you satisfied with the demonstration, or the interpretation of the demonstration? Does anyone see an issue about the flawed method used in the demonstration? Hopefully you are saying, if you want to make the claim that you can lift a full-sized automobile, why don't you go ahead and lift a full-size automobile? It seems obvious to anyone, except Egyptologists, that my car lifting demonstration is an example of flawed methods to conduct research. The issue of scale renders my car lifting demonstration a flawed method and sheds light on the flawed method of moving relatively little stones and then just saying that is how very massive stones were moved. I don't know how Egyptology gets away with it. Egyptology moving relatively tiny stones is just one example of a flawed method used by Egyptology, but there are many other examples. Some Egyptologists have tried to demonstrate how Great Pyramid casing stones were cut to precision using hand tools. The results of their haphazard and nonsensical demonstrations have never produced a casing stone like those of the Great Pyramid. So, yes, Egyptology fits the characteristic of using flawed methods with unrepeatable results better than any other science ever conceived. This includes the science of phrenology. Anyway, let's move on to the next characteristic of a pseudoscience listed on the image. Does Egyptology like lone mavericks working in isolation? That's an important question. Let's look into it and see if this characteristic of a pseudoscience characterizes Egyptology. There are many Egyptologists. There were many phrenologists too at one time. So that doesn't sound like a lone wolf. But all of these Egyptologists are in lockstep with each other, in agreeing with each other in regards to the notion that hand tools were used to make the Great Pyramid casing stones. Also, Egyptologists are in lockstep with each other in agreeing with each other in regards to the idea that strong backed workers drag stones up the imaginary mega ramp. So, Egyptologists are more like a pack of lone wolves parroting what every other Egyptologist says. That doesn't seem like a valid science very much at all. But what about this? Are Egyptologists working with this guy? Or are Egyptologists a group of lone wolves who are working in isolation from this guy? That is an interesting way to look at it. Maybe Egyptologists are really just a pack of lone wolves that are working together with each other but are in isolation from other significant researchers. I know that it sure seems to me that Egyptologists are a bunch of lone wolves who are working in isolation from Christopher Dunn and his research. Here's another thing to consider. Are Egyptologists working with this guy, or are Egyptologists a collection of lone wolves who are working in isolation from this guy? I am sure I know how Mr. Graham would answer that question. He has dealt with Egyptologists firsthand, and his answer would be very enlightening. It seems Egyptologists are a bunch of lone wolves working with each other by parroting what each other says, but are in isolation from Graham and any other researcher who does not parrot what Egyptology says. Maybe there is another example I could come up with. Are Egyptology working with this guy? Or are Egyptologists lone wolves who are working in isolation from this guy? Dr. Robert Schoch has suffered character assassination and vicious attacks from Egyptologists. This is common knowledge. If you don't believe me, look it up or ask him. Attacking scientists like Dr. Robert Schoch is not working with him. Instead of working with these and other researchers, Egyptologists are essentially a group of lone wolves working in isolation. Egyptology has been working in isolation for a very long time. Do they work with stonemasons to learn how precision stone cutting was accomplished using hand tools? No. Egyptology doesn't do that because stonemasons, who are experts, know that creating large scale, extremely precise stone cutting by hand is impossible. That makes it very hard to work with stonemasons, so Egyptologists simply are lone wolves working in isolation from those experienced and knowledgeable experts. To be sure, Egyptologists work with each other by repeating and agreeing with each other, but the so called science of Egyptology is isolated from so many other researchers from different disciplines. Egyptology fits this characteristic of being a pseudoscience. Egyptologists agreeing with each other in an echo chamber, or Egyptologists in a scholarly circle jerk, is damning evidence that Egyptology fits the characteristic of a pseudoscience as listed in the image we are using to determine if Egyptology is a pseudoscience. It seems like the person who made this image about the characteristics of a pseudoscience was actually talking about Egyptology. But let's move on to the next to last bullet point in the image. That bullet point is, does Egyptology use inconsistent and invalid logic? All of these bullet points are interrelated, and I've touched on just some of the poor research methods and the virtual, complete, utter lack of valid demonstrations associated with Egyptology. Moving a tiny stone and then inferring that is how large stones were moved is an example of invalid logical processes that produce falsehoods. There are a bunch of examples of inconsistent and invalid logic associated with Egyptology. The idea that publishing in peer-reviewed journals somehow validates what Egyptology comes up with is an example of boneheaded thinking. Peer-reviewed journals on Egyptology is just a bunch of Egyptologists who all think alike, telling each other what they already think is true. It is just an example of a phony scholarly echo chamber and nothing more. It is also a type of logical fallacy called appealing to authority. In this case, the authority is peer-reviewed journals. Egyptologists, being a tight-knit group of lone mavericks, publish articles in peer-reviewed journals. These peer-reviewed journals are peer-reviewed by Egyptologists who all already believe the same thing. Then they say the information is true because it is in a peer-reviewed journal. This mental circle jerk is actually inconsistent and invalid logic and a wonderful example of circular reasoning. Another related example of Egyptology's inconsistent and invalid logic is to use unanimity of opinion to somehow validate what they think. Egyptologists often say, because this is what we all think, then what we all think is true. That is very inconsistent and invalid logic. And of course, Egyptology is very famous for simply declaring edicts and expecting people to believe the edict because the edict is validated by their authority. Actually, that is not how science works. Authority does not validate truth. The way science works in the real world, not Egyptology, is to develop a hypothesis. Valid and repeatable demonstrations are performed that support the validity of the hypothesis. Egyptology doesn't bother with the scientific method. They think they don't have to because instead they can just declare edicts that they think are valid by virtue of authority. Have you ever heard an Egyptologist say the word hypothesis? Anyway, inconsistent and invalid logic is the hallmark of Egyptology. Now we will move on to the last bullet point on the image. Is Egyptology dogmatic and unyielding? Ask around and see what people say. I would say that Egyptology is very dogmatic and unyielding. All of the other characteristics of Egyptology result in this science being both dogmatic and unyielding. Egyptology passes down their unsubstantiated ideas that are not accompanied with valid demonstrations to the next generation of Egyptologists. One generation of Egyptologists proclaims edicts that the next generation of Egyptologists believe as an act of faith without any valid demonstrations. With very poor research methods, Egyptology has morphed into a bizarre modern day priesthood or a mystery religion. Read a book published in the 1950s that was written by an Egyptologist, or better yet, read a book published in the 1900s that was written by an Egyptologist. Compare those books to a book written by an Egyptologist this year, and nothing of substance has changed. Egyptology is so dogmatic and unyielding that the science of Egyptology has essentially stagnated. It is not really advancing at all. In contrast, every other science, like mathematics or physics or metallurgy or chemistry and biology, have all advanced tremendously in the last 100 years. There is a revolution in knowledge because of the monumental advances in all of these and other sciences. Yet, because Egyptology is profoundly dogmatic and unyielding, this science has not really changed at all in 100 years. Egyptology is certainly dogmatic and unyielding in regards to their unproven idea of precision stone cutting using hand tools. They have believed that story for over 100 years without a single demonstration creating a casing stone like those at the Great Pyramid. The same holds true for the mythical Big Ramp and all the other edicts they are dogmatic and unyielding about. If Egyptology can't even get one casing stone right, just imagine how much other stuff they are wrong about. So it seems that Egyptology fits to a T every single characteristic listed in this image for being a pseudoscience. If it looks like a pseudoscience and quacks like a pseudoscience, then Egyptology is definitely a pseudoscience. Let me explain where we are right now. There was a time, not long ago, that the science of phrenology was taught in universities. It was considered to be settled science. That was that. But even when Egyptology was still being taught in universities, there were courageous people who risked their reputations and careers questioning the validity of phrenology. We all know the story of the science of phrenology's fall and utter rejection, being relegated to a mere pseudoscience. If it was not for those courageous people who questioned the validity of the settled science of phrenology, it would still be taught in universities. By the way, if you ever get a chance to thank someone who questions settled science, make sure you take the time to thank them because they have helped you more than you know. If it wasn't for someone questioning the settled science of spraying DDT on your children, it would still be going on. Believe me, there has been a lot of settled science that has been rejected because a few courageous people questioned what the majority thought was settled science. Anyway, where we are right now is that Egyptology is still being taught in universities as settled science, but there are people, myself included, who question the validity of much of Egyptology. Many are questioning much more of Egyptology than I have touched on here. So even though some think that Egyptology is settled science, it is being questioned and rejected by more people every day. Sciences come and go. Egyptology, in its present form, will not prevail. If you believe Egyptology is a settled science that cannot be questioned, you are on the wrong side of history. Will Egyptology change from being a pseudoscience so that it does not meet the same fate as phrenology? No, that won't happen. Egyptologists would rather face destruction than change. That is the nature of a pseudoscience. Their ego and hostility to criticism and their dogmatic and unyielding nature will not allow them to change. The pseudoscience of Egyptology will die off as Egyptologists die off, and a time will come that Egyptologists will be as insignificant as those who still believe Great Pyramid Bible correlations without causation, or phrenology. So there you have it. Egyptology met every criteria listed in the image about the distinction between real science and pseudoscience. Egyptology is a pseudoscience and will suffer the same sad fate as did phrenology and every other pseudoscience. So thank you for watching, and please visit my website at www.thepump.org. Watch my other fascinating videos on my YouTube channel and subscribe. Like me on Facebook. I hope you read my 2 books and watch my 2 documentaries about the Great Pyramid. I wish you the best on your journey seeking truth, if that is your goal.